And the book that I read, you mentioned as far as loaning to um, to a corporation, one may not have a lot of regulatory requirement in there. Is that correct?
What do you mean? Do you mean if your investors are lending you money?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really up to the company that's raising money to set the terms. So you could say, I'm raising money in the form of loans, and I'm not, and I don't. There's not going to be any collateral. There's not going to be any personal guarantees. There's no. I could be up to 10 days late with my payment. It's sort of up to you to decide. There's no requirement on what the terms are really. But obviously, you want to make your terms attractive to investors. You don't want to make them so, so difficult for investors to even imagine ever getting paid. Then it might be hard to raise money. But you surprised, some people are offering instruments on these platforms where really the chance that the investors will ever get paid is very low, and people are still investing. There's an instrument called a crowd safe. And the chance that the investor will ever get paid is super low. But people are still investing, and I think the reason is that, one, it's a fairly small amount that they're investing, so they're not, they can afford to lose it if it doesn't work out. And then they're hoping that maybe there will be that chance that that company will end up doing really well, and they'll end up hitting it big with that company. I don't necessarily recommend that strategy, but some people are using that strategy where it's a really high risk but a potentially high return.
Can you briefly mention the history of crowdfunding? Because crowdfunding is a pretty new investment type. Please explain
how
the history of it.
Well, I mean, the term crowdfunding first came to be, gosh, I'm trying to remember. It was I think mid to late 2000s, where there were some websites like Kickstarter and Indiegogo that created this concept of everyone can fund you. But with those platforms, you couldn't invest. It couldn't be a security. You could only basically get a reward for you're basically donating money and you get some kind of a reward, like a T-shirt or a download of a video or something like that. And so that concept of crowdfunding really took off when it first came out. People were really excited about it. And then meanwhile, there was this other way of raising money where you actually could have people invest. But the regulatory issues were a little bit difficult to manage. So we used to call it, back then we called it a direct public offering. And it wasn't very commonly done because there were some regulatory issues you had to deal with. Basically, you had to do state-by-state compliance. So, for example, Ben and Jerry's ice cream, back in the early 80s when they were first starting out, they needed to get a production facility, and they did a public offering of their securities, but only to Vermont residents. Because if they had done more than one state, it would have added to the complexity of it. So, but they successfully raised about $750,000, and they went on to be a very successful company. So this idea of investment crowdfunding has been around for a while, but it just hasn't been very well known. It was a little bit onerous to deal with the state level regulations. So back in 2010, I was leading a nonprofit with a colleague named Janelle Orsi. We co-founded a nonprofit, and we decided to have our summer interns write a letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the body that governs securities regulation. And we said, why don't you create a new law that allows people to raise money from, everyone that they want to reach out to and publicly advertise it, as long as nobody can invest more than $100 each. Because we thought, if you can't invest more than $100 each, what's the very worst that can happen? Okay, people lose $100. It's not the end of the world. So we submitted that letter back in the summer of 2010 to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And it's publicly posted on their website. And we got a lot of people to write letters of support. I think there were more letters of support for that proposal than they had ever gotten for any proposal before. But they didn't really respond to it at all. But we actually got some attention from some federal legislators and also from someone in the president's office, the White House. So little by little, the idea grew that maybe there should be a federal law that allows for investment crowdfunding instead of having to do it at the state level. And so in 2012, amazingly enough, the Jobs Act was passed. And I actually got to go to the signing ceremony at the White House when President Obama signed the law. And part of that law said that you can raise money from the public, anyone can invest, and it was way more than $100 per person that people could invest. They could invest basically 10% of their net worth or annual income. And so the law was passed, but it took 4 years for that part of the law to actually go into effect. 4 years. So people were very frustrated because when the law passed in 2012, people were so excited to start getting these investment crowdfunding campaigns going nationwide without having to do all the regulatory stuff with the states that could take several months. But it took 4 years to go into effect. So it finally went into effect in May of 2015. And by then, a lot of the people who had been so excited about it had kind of moved on to do different things. But, there were some people who stuck with it. There are now about 36 platforms out there. Most of the platforms that exist are not really very viable. There's probably about 6 or 7 or 8 that are, doing well. They have a lot of campaigns on them. There's probably been a total of about 500 campaigns that have happened since it initially became legal almost 2 years ago. And, people are having pretty good success with them. And also, interestingly, unlike in the world of venture capital, the statistics are showing that women and people of color are having just as much success with it as white men. So it kind of levels the playing field somewhat when you can reach out to everybody.
You mentioned earlier that one can actually invest 10% of their asset. Does this one still apply?
Yeah, so you can invest up to 10% of the lower of your annual income or net worth, basically. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's generally how much you can invest. And that's over a year. So if I invested in 10 different campaigns in a year, that would be the cap for all 10.
Okay. Now you mentioned there are quite a few platforms. Are they all approved by the SEC?
Yes, they have to go through a process where they're approved by the SEC, and they also have to be members of FINRA, the Financial Regulatory Organization. So you have to go through a process with FINRA. You don't have to be a fully licensed broker-dealer, which is nice because being a licensed broker-dealer is a very onerous thing. But they have a special category of membership for something they call funding portals. And your portal has to be approved by FINRA, and they put you through a lot of hoops. Like you have to submit your fingerprints, and they have to look at your website and make sure it has all the functionality that it's supposed to have. So they have all of them have gone through that process. There has already been one whose permit was revoked because they weren't actually complying with the rules. So it is a little bit of a Wild West right now, I'd say, but the good news is that people aren't investing a lot of money. So even if they end up losing their money, hopefully it won't be too horrible.
So if the one has to raise, let's say, $1 million, I believe either Indiegogo or Kickstarter, one can actually do it without reaching that $1 million fund. Is that still correct, or you have to reach that goal?
Well, with investment crowdfunding, you have to set a minimum goal, but you can go above the minimum. So I actually raised money myself using this tool, and we set our minimum goal. Gosh, I can't remember. I think we might have set it at $50,000, but we ended up raising $400,000. So as long as you don't go over that $1,070,000, you can go over your minimum goal.
What's the difference between Regulation D, private placement, and crowdfunding?
Yeah, well, Regulation D has 3 different parts to it. So Regulation D includes a private offering where all of your investors are accredited. So that's very different from crowdfunding because all of your investors have to be accredited basically, and you cannot publicly advertise it. Then there's Rule 506C, which is also part of Reg D, which does allow you to publicly advertise it, but you also have to make sure all the investors are accredited. Then there's something called Rule 504, which is a very nice exemption. A lot of people don't know about Rule 504 under Reg D. It allows you to do a public offering, and you can actually raise up to $5 million. However, you do have to do state-by-state compliance. So that's the big difference there. Is if you want to just, let's say you wanted to just raise money in one state. You said, my business is focused within a single state. And I really only want to raise money from residents of that state. You could do it under Rule 504. You would have to comply with the state regulations, which could take anywhere from 1 month to 5 months to do. But you could do that. But if you want to go ahead and offer to the whole country and not deal with the state level regulations, then you would do this new way of doing it, which is the Title III of the Jobs Act, also known as Regulation Crowdfunding.
Okay, so crowdfunding is nationwide. Would that also apply for foreigners if they want to invest, or there's a restriction on that?
Well, foreigners can invest in a Title III offering. However, every country, I would imagine, I don't know for sure, but every country has its own securities regulations. So if I am raising money under Title III, and I send an email to someone in another country and tell them, hey, I'm raising money on this platform, check it out, I might be violating the law of that country. So that's the only problem. You want to be careful that you're not inadvertently breaking the law of the country where the investors are coming from. But if they hear about it on their own, and you didn't solicit them, chances are it's probably okay. But who knows? I mean, every country is different. There could be countries where they say, no, it's completely illegal for you to offer an investment opportunity to anyone in our country unless you jump through XYZ hoops and fill out these forms and pay this fee, so you do have to be careful. But from a U.S. perspective, it's fine for people all over the world to invest.
So a foreigner who wants to raise money, is that possible that he would open a corporation?
Yes, it's possible, but you would have to form a U.S. company. So you'd have to form a company under U.S. law. So maybe, you could be operating in a totally different company, but the company that raises money would have to be formed like under Delaware law or some state law.
Okay, let's say that one is interested to move forward to raise funds. What do they need to do first?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that is a really good idea to do is start looking at some of the platforms that are out there and get a sense of which one feels like the best fit for you. Some of the top ones are WeFunder, Start Engine. There's one it's Indiegogo actually has one tied to this other company called Microventure. So there's quite a few. So you can look at all of the ones that are out there and see which one. There's one called Republic also. So then the next step, if you want to do it without having to spend a lot of money and start looking into what the requirements are, you could just contact the people at your top 3 or 4 platforms and just ask them, how do I raise money on your platform? And they are usually pretty helpful because they would like to see a lot more campaigns going on. So they're not getting nearly as much volume as I think they would like to have. So if that would be a really good place to start, is just start calling a few of them and asking, look at their website first, because often they'll have information on their website, and then just call them and say, hey, I want to learn more about how I can raise money on your platform.
How about making business plan? Is that also one of the items that they need from us?
You don't need a business plan. You do need to share information about your business. It doesn't have to be in the form of a business plan, but you want to share basic information about your business, what you do, how you make money. You also do have to share financials, historical financials prepared by a CPA. So there's some things that you do have to share, but it's pretty flexible in terms of what that looks like. There's no really strict requirements on exactly what the format is or, how you present it. There are some questions that you do have to fill out. There's something called a Form C. So you do have to complete the Form C, but that's very, very simple. And then other than that, you just want to disclose as much as you can about what would be relevant for the investor. You don't want to hide anything from the potential investors. You want them to know all the details of what you're doing and who's on your team and what your plans are and all of that.
And you mentioned the history of financial. What happened if one does not have history of?
That's fine. If you're just starting out, it's totally fine. There's no requirement that you have a history of financials. Like maybe you just formed your company yesterday and there hasn't been any money put in or money taken out. That's fine. You still actually do have to pay an accountant to prepare the financials, even though there won't be any activity in them, which I know is kind of silly, but that is the requirement.
And once those form are filled, what's next?
What's next after you do? Oh, once you complete the form. Well, so there's one part of it so some people will say, I want to do this on the cheap. I don't want to hire a lawyer to help me. And I always say, you probably could actually do this without hiring the lawyer, and you could do it fairly cheaply and just work with the platform and have them help you. But one really big decision that you want to make that you might want a lawyer to help you make is what to offer to the investors, because there's actually a lot of flexibility there. And sometimes the platforms will encourage you to offer a certain type of security. So, for example, there's one platform where they really like you to use this thing called a crowd safe that I mentioned earlier. And I don't think that's a very good instrument. In my opinion, that's not a great thing to offer because it's too risky for the investors. So one thing that I would be careful about is deciding what you want to offer. Is it going to be equity? Is it going to be debt? How do you document that? So if you really want to do it right, and it's worth it to do it right, because if you bring in investors in a way that doesn't really fit the model of your business, it can really make your life difficult down the road. So I would say consult with a really good attorney who understands all of the different options in terms of what you can offer to the investors and design an offering that really fits your vision for the future, what you want to see happen with your company. Like, are you looking to grow it really fast and then sell it? Are you looking to grow more slow and steady and maybe have your investors participate in profit sharing? So that's the one part that they don't really tell you, because often they just want you to get up on the platform as quickly as possible, and they try to make it seem really simple, like, oh yeah, here, just use this. They'll give you like an off-the-shelf instrument, and I think that it's worth spending some real time and energy thinking that through before you start raising money.
Also, another thing is that you mentioned in the book that crowdfunding, the owner or the person who's raising the fund doesn't need to lose the control, versus if you go to venture capitalists, you may lose the control of the company. Can you explain that more, please?
Yeah, so if you go to a venture capital type fund or an angel investor who is using the venture capital model, they will pretty much expect a certain set of terms that will usually involve you having to give up control at some point, and your investors will eventually become your boss. But that's not necessary. If you raise money from the crowd, you set the terms. And usually the people you raise money from, they don't even really want control. They're busy people. They have their own lives. They don't want to come in and control your business. So that's the nice thing about crowdfunding is you can design your offering in such a way where you're not giving up any control. Even if you sell equity, you can have non-voting equity. So you can give up some ownership of your company, but not give up any control. So that's the beauty of raising money from the crowd is no one is going to be concerned. I mean, I've never known anyone to say, oh, well, I want voting rights because their investment size is fairly small. You know, you have a larger number of smaller investors, so they just simply don't expect to have voting rights.
I see. Do you actually have a board members in there, and also how do you do the report to the investor?
Yeah, so I mean, most of my clients choose to keep their board really small. Just usually they're the only board member. So the founder is the board. And you don't have to do that. I have another client right now that really wants their investors to have a board seat. So even though they're doing crowdfunding, they want their investors to elect someone to the board. So that's totally up to you. But you don't have to do that. In terms of reporting, that is going to vary a bit depending on the state that your company is formed in. But usually with equity investors, there are some reporting requirements, annual reporting requirements. Especially when you have a larger number of equity investors, you are supposed to send an annual report. Also, under the Federal Jobs Act, there is a report that's required to be filed. But in most cases, you only have to do it once, and then you're no longer obligated to continue reporting.
Okay, let's say we have a person or company that say, okay, Jenny, let's do it. What do they start?
Well, the very first thing I would help them figure out is the overall strategy. So a lot of people might come to me and say, I definitely know I want to do crowdfunding. But some people come to me and they're not sure. They want to know what all their options are. But either way, I like to help people understand all the different options because you can actually combine different options together. So for example, you could say, okay, I know I want to do crowdfunding, but I don't want to start it until May. And now it's February. So what I'm going to do is for the rest of February, March, and April, I'm going to do a private offering under Reg D. And then I'm going to switch to a public offering under Title III of the Jobs Act. And then after that, I'm going to switch to a Rule 506C under the Jobs Act, which is the one that allows you to raise money from accredited investors and do public advertising. So I want people to know all the different options so that they can choose the strategy that's best for them. And then, of course, what should you offer? Like I was saying before, should it be equity? Should it be debt? How should it be structured? How do your investors get paid? What is the exit strategy for your investors? So I like to help people really think through all those options and design something that fits their particular situation. And sometimes that might mean having to change your structure. So I've had clients that had an LLC and they realized that it would actually be better if they had a corporation. So we had to switch from an LLC to a corporation. So we figure all of that out. And then once you have that figured out, it's just a matter of getting up on the platform and, of course, planning your marketing campaign. Because I recommend that you just do a fairly short campaign, like 2 months. And so you want to, as soon as you are up on the platform and your 2 months starts, you want to really hit the ground running and know what your strategy is going to be for getting the word out. And if you can, you want to spend like a majority of your time for that 2 months getting the word out about it. Because if you just put it up on the platform and sit back and do nothing, you may not raise that much money. So you want to, be sure and maybe host events at your house or at your place of business. Go and speak at conferences. Call everyone that you know in the media and tell them you're raising money. Put it up on your website. Do social media. Everything you can think of. Email everyone you know 10 times. do everything you can think of to get the word out. And I think having those conversations with people, either on the phone or in person, that's what usually leads to people investing more money, because there's that personal connection. So just trying to have as many conversations every day as you can with people who are potential investors.
Can you say a few tips that the fundraiser may have done not the right way, or that you will, to avoid any future mistake? Can you give some tips, please?
Well, one thing I have noticed is that if I had a client who, and this was still very early on before we really knew what was working well and what wasn't, and she ended up taking 6 months to raise money on one of these platforms, and I think that was a mistake. I think making it shorter makes it more successful, because when you have 6 months, everyone who's thinking about investing, they just say, oh, I'll do it later. There's no sense of urgency. So you just really want to do everything you can to create a sense of urgency. And what you can do is even create within the 2 months, you can create artificial deadlines. Like, hey, if you invest this week, you get a t-shirt. Or hey, when I was raising money, we would send out an email and we would say, if you invest by this date, so-and-so will make a matching investment. So anything you can do to keep creating a sense of urgency and excitement, and do it fast, just take that 2 months and really put all your energy and effort into getting as many people as possible to invest. Also, another thing is giving incentives for larger amounts, because if you set your minimum, like when I did it, I set my minimum at $1,000, and you want to find ways to encourage people to invest more than the minimum. So that might involve giving some kind of a perk. Like you could say our minimum is $1,000. However, if you invest $5,000, you get to come to this really cool event. If you invest $10,000, you get this extra special limited edition something. I don't know what, So that's another thing, is finding ways to reward people for coming in at higher amounts. So those are some of the things I would think about.
Thank you, Jenny, for your time.